I'm showing you some further examples, and these are all experiments that we have been doing along the years. So you can observe collective behavior in aggregations of cells, in cells colonies, where, I mean, if the colony becomes large enough in terms of number of cells, there are very interesting nematic patterns on the larger scale. Then insect swarms, as I've been telling you, is another interesting example. And we have been doing experiments both on swarms of mosquitoes and of midges. And the last examples here in the top row is the one of bird flocks that I already mentioned. So now, why are these systems interesting from the standpoint of statistical physics? For two reasons. The first reason is that these are interacting systems. So the idea is that you have these animals, the little animals or cells, that interact with each other, and due to these interactions, you observe an emergence of large-scale order and large-scale patterns, okay? So this is the first reason. The second reason is that these are out of equilibrium systems. Why are these out of equilibrium systems? Because each unit in the group is endowed with a mechanism which is able to transform energy into motion. So these are systems which are driven at the individual level. Each individual has a motor, has a self-propulsion mechanism, okay? So they are out of equilibrium, and they are out of equilibrium in a highly non-trivial way. Now, usually the branch of statistical physics which deals with this kind of self-propelled systems is called active matter. And there are many examples also among non-living systems. And in the bottom row, you can see a few of these examples. So this is a system where you have rice grains, and these rice grains are in a dish which is tapped, so they are activated. And the second example is something similar. Also in this case, you have very small disks, again, which are endowed with a self-propulsion mechanism. And the third example is a system of Janus particles, which are put in motion by a magnetic field. So this whole class of problems has been studied a lot from the theoretical and the experimental point of view. And we know that due to the fact that there are interactions and there are out of equilibrium features, the observed behavior is non-trivial. So here in this slide, I made just a few examples of this non-trivial behavior. So here on the left, you can see the result of a simulation of particles which have only repulsive interactions, nothing more, but they are self-propelled. So what one observes is that in a certain region of the phase space, there are large aggregated regions which are created. And you would not have these patterns in absence of the motility of the particles. So this is a phenomenon which is due to the fact that the particles are mobile, that the system is out of equilibrium. So this is called motility-induced phase separation. The name itself suggests what is the origin of the behavior. Here on the right, another example, which is the one that interests me more. And in this case, you have some particles, and these particles interact with each other with alignment rules. So one particle, if there is a nearby particle which is close enough, tends to align to it, okay? So it is the same kind of interaction that you would have in a ferromagnet. But contrary to the ferromagnet, where the spins are fixed on a lattice, here the particles move. So who interacts with whom changes with time. And this is the origin of the non-equilibrium behavior. And what one can show numerically and also experimentally, it has been shown, is that in 2D, this system displays long-range order, contrary to the equilibrium counterpart, which is the XY model, where you don't have long-range order in the equal to. Okay, so this is just to say that the out of equilibrium nature of the system can dramatically change its behavior and can dramatically change the ordering properties, okay? But what I would like to do today, however, is not just focus on order, but also focus on another very important point, very interesting features of system where you have emergent properties, which is response. But before going to that, let me tell you a little bit more about the systems that we have been looking at and the motivations of my study. Okay, so these are the examples of the two systems that on which we have a lot of data, swarms, flocks, and swarms. In both these cases, we can observe large-scale patterns. What does it mean? It means that if you compute the correlation function between the individual velocities of the birds or on the insects, these correlation functions are scale-free. Okay, so they have very large-scale correlations, so large-scale correlated patterns. But in one case, the system is ordered, and this is the case of flocks, where everybody moves in the same direction. In the other case, insects, the system is not directionally ordered. There is no directional order, and the swarm remains confined in a well-defined position in space, location in space. Okay, so two examples where we have collective patterns, large-scale correlations, but different degree of order. Okay, so before going on with what we know from the data, let me tell you a little bit about what is the theoretical framework to study these systems. There are very simple models of collective motion, they are called in this way. And the minimal scheme of these models is depicted in this equation here. So this is an equation for the velocity and the position of a given particle. And as you can see from the top equation, the velocity varies in a Langevin kind form. And the force on the right-hand side is an alignment force. And this quantity here, Nij, is the interaction matrix. So this is different from 0 if I and j interact, otherwise it is 0. Okay. So this is just an alignment force, and then there is noise. The self-propulsion is encoded into the fact that the speed of these individuals is either fixed or constrained by a speed potential. It's the same. In this case, the simplest thing that you can do is to assume it is fixed, or you can assume that there is a potential fixing it within small fluctuations. Okay, so if you look at this equation here, this is exactly the same equation that you would write down for the Langevin dynamics of a classical ferromagnet. Okay, the difference is, again, what is the difference? That for a ferromagnet, this Nij is a fixed matrix. For a system of active particles, this changes in time. So this quantity here changes in time. So the network of interaction rearranges in time because individuals move. Okay. This is a slightly more general form of the same equation, where we don't just have the first order derivative, but also the second order derivative. And I just wrote this equation because in some cases, to reproduce the data, you need to put back this second order derivative. Okay, so this is a very simple models. They can be studied either with numerical simulations or building up field theories which reproduce these microscopic at the mesoscopic scale, this macroscopic behavior. Now, what is the resulting phase diagram of models of this kind? So typically, it's like the one of a ferromagnet, okay? But in this case, in the ferromagnet, the order parameter is the magnetization. In this case, the order parameter is the global degree of alignment of all the individuals in the group. So this is usually called the polarization, and it is this big phi here. So again, if we want to understand the behavior of the system, we can plot on the x-axis the control parameter, for example, the strength of the interaction or the strength of the noise, okay? And we can see what happens when I tune this control parameter. So for very large noise, what we get is a disordered region, okay? When I decrease the amount of noise, I get an ordered region, okay? And here the correlations decay very quickly. Here the correlation in the critical region are scale-free because I'm close to the ordering transition. And in the low noise phase, they are still scale-free because I've broken a continuous symmetry, so I have soft modes. So this region here, this colored region here, is consistent with the correlations that we observe in the data. But then I told you that swarms, they are not ordered. So they are placed here in this region here, critical, large-scale correlations, but no order. On the contrary, flocks are in this low temperature, large order region. Very good. So what about, this is the general picture, but now what about the role of activity? How strong are non-equilibrium effects for these kind of systems? Actually, what it turns out is that out of equilibrium effects are much milder for flocks than for swarms, okay? And let me tell you a little bit about this. So these are experiments on flocks where you have this big flocks that at some point, either because some falcon arrived, some predator arrived, or some endogenous strong fluctuation occurred, they turn. Okay, so this is a response behavior of the flock to some kind of perturbation. So they turn all together, and we would like to analyze quantitatively this behavior. Now, I will not spend a lot of time on how we did that, but the important point for the rest of my talk is that if you look at the individual trajectories of this movement, here there is a zoom of 3 trajectories of 3 different birds. What you see is that when they turn, they maintain their relative positions. So even though this is a global rearrangement, so a change of the system state on the global scale, a global response to something that happened, they do not change their positions during the whole response event, okay? And so this means that on the timescales that are relevant for our observations, which are macroscopic timescales, the network of interactions is basically fixed, okay? This observation, this comment that I'm making, can be also quantified if I look at the relaxation time of the correlation functions of the orientations and the relaxation time of the network. What we see, these are experimental data, that the relaxation time of the orientational correlations is always smaller than the time with which the network rearranges. So we have this separation of timescales, so that basically for what interests us is as if the system was fixed, okay? And indeed, what one can show is that if I use one of these models, of the models that I wrote in one of my previous slides, but I assume that the network is fixed, I can predict quantitatively very nicely the propagation law of the system. So I can predict the propagation speed as a function of the degree of order, okay, which is this theoretical prediction. And this theoretical prediction very nicely fit the data. So I can assume that there are no equilibrium effects and I get a good result. Okay, this is the main line. So for flocks, out of equilibrium effects are not so important. Now let's see what happens in swarms. In swarms, it is completely different. So if I compare the time scale of decay of the orientational correlations and the time scale of rearrangement of the network, on many scales, they are always of the same order. And this is what plotted here. Here are the 2 time scales of the velocity correlation and of the network, looked at many different spatial scales, and they always are of the same order. So this means that on the time scale where things happens from the point of view of orientations, the network changes. So I cannot assume a fixed network. I would do a very, very wrong assumption in that case. And indeed, if we look at the behavior of the system, and in particular, we look for natural swarms at correlation functions in time and space, what I find is that they obey very nicely dynamic scaling behavior with some exponent, which is this Z here, the critical dynamic exponent, which it is what it is. We found this value in the data. And actually, we can build a field theory able to reproduce precisely this behavior. But if we don't put activity, if we don't take into account the non-equilibrium nature of the dynamics, we get it wrong. So this is a case whether it is truly important to take into account the non-equilibrium features of the model. Okay, so now we have these 2 situations. So flocks are very ordered and they exhibit a quasi-equilibrium response. Swarms, they are quasi-critical because they are in this critical region and they are strongly out of equilibrium. So now we would like to understand, to rationalize from a theoretical point of view, why there is this difference and what is in the mechanistic aspects of these systems that leads to the behavior that we observe. So to do that, we just take a huge step and we go away from the data and from the analysis of natural system, and we look at this problem from the theoretical perspective. So to do that, as usual, what I do is that I take the simplest, minimal, the most minimal model that I can think about, okay? And this is one of the models written in one of my first slides. So again, I have this Langevin equation for the orientations, for the velocities, and the alignment force has this shape here. So there is an alignment term, which is due by this first term. And then there is a constraining potential for the speed. So I want that the speed is fixed by my self-propulsion mechanism. So this is the self-propulsion mechanism, okay? Okay, so I have this model, and I would like to compute the response. So I can do that doing different tricks, either analytically or numerically. But the thing I'm interested into is to understand what is the non-equilibrium contribution to the response behavior. So now usually what happens in an equilibrium system, we have what are called fluctuation dissipation relationships between the response and the correlation function. So this fluctuation relationship, which I wrote as FDT with an acronym, just to be quick, is precisely what is written here in black. So the response function in the stationary state, the response function is just proportional to the derivative of the correlation function, and the proportionality constant is the inverse temperature. Now, if the system is out of equilibrium, I expect that this relation is violated and that there would be an additional contribution due to the fact that my system is active and the particles are self-propelled, okay? Very well, so I would like to study this behavior here. Of course, what do I mean with the response function? This means that if I'm interested in understanding how what happens when my system is perturbed, so if I focus on a given observable O, okay, what I would do to study response behavior is to add to my Hamiltonian a perturbation in the variable O. So I add an adjunct field H conjugated to this observable, and then the response and the correlations are defined in the usual way. Okay, so I can choose this O in many different ways, but the simplest thing to do, really the simplest possible one, is to look at the response of the mean velocity. The mean velocity characterizes the degree of order in my systems, so I just look at the global mean velocity. So I can do some computations, and what I find is that the response behavior has this form here. So there is the equilibrium part, and then there is the violation, okay? And this violation turns out to be quite simple because it is another correlation function, which is a correlation function. This is not symmetric in time, and it is a correlation function between the polarization, the degree of alignment, and the velocity, okay? Okay, so this is interesting for two reasons. The first reason is that we have a quantitative measure of the violation. And the second reason is that actually this expression here allows me to compute the response without perturbing the system, because both this correlation C of t and this D of t, they are at zero field, okay? So I have a way to understand how my system will react when perturbed before perturbing it. Okay, just in terms of correlation functions that I can compute in absence of the perturbation. So this is just a numerical test of this equation to show you that we did the computation correctly. Okay, so now that we have an expression for this violation, we can compute that. Okay, we can compute that, and this is the result. So this is the violation factor, D of t, computed at many different temperatures. So for this system, the critical temperature is Tc equal 10, and it is this green curve, okay? Therefore, what this figure is telling us is that overall, this violation is stronger at Tc. So we have a violation which is stronger at Tc. Another way to evaluate the degree of violation of the FTT relation is not to look at the at the equation for the response, but to integrate this equation and to look at the integrated response, okay, which is this one on the right. And this is plotted here. So in equilibrium, I should get this straight black line, okay, here. And out of equilibrium, as you can see, our system is out of equilibrium. My curve departs from the equilibrium behavior. Okay, so these are two different ways to look at violation of equilibrium properties. One via this d of t violation factor, and one via this integrated response behavior. On top of that, let me add that one can define what is usually called in the literature effective temperature, which is defined in this way, which is not always a temperature, it's an abuse of language if you want, but let me call it in this way because this is what is very frequently found in the literature. And this effective temperature should be equal to T if we are at equilibrium, and should be different from T if we are out of equilibrium. So we have these different quantifiers of non-equilibrium behavior. Let me also comment on another point. If we look at this D of T, we see that there is clearly something happening on the short scales, which is this big peak, okay? And then there is a large scale decay, which is longer the closer I am to TC, okay? So there is some local process which seems to be always the same, occurring always at the same time scale, independently than the temperature, and a longer decay, which is temperature dependent and tends to be larger the closer I am to TC. So this seems something critical, okay? And we will see that it is. Okay, so to quantify a little better this violation of equilibrium, we can choose two indicators, two scalar indicators, two numbers. The first number is the height of this peak, and this quantifies the degree of violation of FDT at short scales. And then we can look at the effective temperature as T goes to infinity, here, okay, at large times. And this quantifies the violation of FDT at large scales. So what do we find is the following. So this is the local indicator, this is the global indicator. Both of them, they peak at TC. So the violation of equilibrium is stronger, both locally and globally, at the transition temperature, okay? So we would like to understand why. What is the origin of this behavior? Why is it like that? So to understand better and to give an interpretation of what we see, an interesting thing to do is to relate the violations of the fluctuation dissipation theorem with another indicator of non-equilibrium behavior. This other indicator of non-equilibrium behavior is what is called the entropy production rate. So the entropy production rate, it measures how strongly the state balance is violated, okay? So the definition is the following. I first assign an entropy to each given trajectory. And this is the entropy of a given trajectory is just this logarithm. I take the trajectory, x of t, x is a generic degree of freedom. I take the trajectory x of t, and I compute its probability. Then I take the time reversed trajectory, which is this x crossed, okay? And I compute the logarithm of the ratio of these probabilities, okay? This is the entropy associated to one specific trajectory. Then I average, and I get the average entropy production, what is called the average entropy production. Then I take the rate, and this is the entropy production rate. So if the system is at equilibrium, this entropy production rate would be 0 because I have detailed balance. And this is just another indicator. So the interesting thing about this entropy production is that we can compute this semi-analytically, let's say, and we find this expression here. Starting from the equation of motion, we find this expression here, where this expression, okay, it is what it is, but the important point is that you see explicitly that out of equilibrium, violation of detailed balance and out of equilibrium behavior is related to the rate of change of the interaction network, which is this derivative here. And since interactions occurs on a short scale, because these are all short scale models, entropy production occurs on short spatial scales. So entropy is produced locally in space, okay? This is the first observation. The second observation is that I can, working with a little bit of an analytical computation, I can also rewrite this entropy production in terms of the violation of FDT that I've introduced before, and in particular on the contribution, the self-contribution to the violation of a fluctuation dissipation relation, which is this quantity here. These are called Arada-Sasa relationships, and they have been computed for other systems by Arada-Sasa, and we have adapted the computation here. So, here is the plot of the EPR, and we see that the EPR peaks at T, okay? So, since the EPR is related to the self-contribution of the violation factor, we understand why the local violation of FDT peaks at TC. It peaks at TC because it is related to EPR, and EPR is related to the rearrangement of the network, and the rearrangement of the network is maximal at TC because TC is the place where we have the largest diffusion of particles, okay? So we have an explanation, everything is consistent. We know that the local contribution of the fluctuation dissipation violation should peak at TC because it is related to dissipation that is produced locally, and that is maximal at TC. So this is the first observation. But then how is it that it then becomes also a global phenomenon? Because we have seen, I've told you that FDT violations are also observed on the large scale. Well, this is due to the fact that in fact, this system is an interacting system. So there are correlated regions in the system, and these correlated regions becomes larger the closer I am to TC. So this propagation of out of equilibrium features to the large scale is due to the fact that we have these large scale correlations that connect each part of the system with each other. And actually this interpretation is corroborated if we look at the behavior of D of T with the sides of the system. So now what I do is that I place myself at TC and I increase the size of the system. So the larger the size, the larger the violation. But then I can do something very simple. I can rescale by the height of the peak so that all these curves have the same y scale, okay? And what I observe is that I can rescale all the curves one on top of the other if I plot the D of T as a function of time divided L to the Z, where Z is the critical dynamic exponent for this system. So what does it mean? It means that each of these curves has a time scale, a decay time scale, which is the critical time scale for this system, so that if I divide each curve by its characteristic time, I get a collapse, which is what I get on the right. So this is just to confirm that the large scale decay is a critical phenomenon, and it occurs on time scales that scale with the system size, and where the exponent is precisely the exponent that has been computed for this system with a field theory approach. Okay, so to summarize, because my time is up, what I've been telling you is that I've been looking at violations in equilibrium properties of the response behavior of the system in very simple models, and I've shown you that these violations occur on all time scales, and that the global amount of this violation peaks at TC. The mechanism is that entropy is produced, and therefore violation of equilibrium features are produced locally on the spatial scale of the interactions and on very short time scales. Okay, and these causes determines the short time behavior of the violation factor D of T, and then cooperative processes close to the transition cause a propagation of this of equilibrium effect to the whole system. Now, this is consistent with what we observed in the data, because what we observe in the data is precisely that in flux, which are very ordered and where mutual diffusion is very small and the network rearranges very slowly, non-equilibrium effects are basically very low, while on swarms, which are close to the critical transition, they are very very important. And with this, I conclude my talk. And this is our group, okay? And these are the three people who worked mostly on this on this project, which is basically part of the PhD project of Mario. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Irene, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm very appreciative. I have two questions. The first one is how can you incorporate in your theory external perturbations which change qualitatively the dynamics pattern of flux, for instance, like with the change of the weather, the flux starts circulating, making these beautiful patterns. And the second question is, again, how can you explain or incorporate the appearance of synchronicity in swarms? Like, for instance, flickering of fireflies. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I heard correctly because I couldn't hear very well. So the first question is related to how we can incorporate a perturbation. I guess you meant experimentally, right?
Yes.
Okay. So with bird flocks, actually, this is not something that we can control very well because the experiments that we do are experiments of video tracking. So basically, we have a stereometric, complicated setup of many video cameras, and we shoot at the flocks from far away. So flocks are 200, 300 meters from us, okay? So to realize a perturbation in this case would mean, I don't know, to send a drone or something like that. And this is really not something that you can easily do, okay? For several reasons, you cannot do that. It's not something feasible. So what we can do is just to observe our flocks and assume that something occurs when they turn. Now, this is something, sometimes we really see the falcon, okay, a predator approaching the group. So in some cases, this might really be an external perturbation, but this could also be some sort of very large fluctuation that occurred in the flock, for example, due to boundary birds. Maybe some boundary birds are more susceptible than the flocks that are inside the group, and so sometimes they have atypical fluctuations. So this might also be seen as a perturbation field. Okay, but we can do nothing. We can just observe and take the data. For swarms, it is different because swarms are very small, and we have been doing experiments also with perturbation. So we did two kinds of experiments. There would be much more to say about this, but I didn't have the time, and we have really preliminary results. So the first kind of perturbation has been acoustic. Okay, so we have these swarms of many individuals. At point, we make a sound. Okay, and this sound is at a frequency that we know is the frequency at which they react for biological reasons. So we have this data where we have perturbations with these
Я нічого не робив. У нас інтернету немає. Пропало, все пропало.